You're watching the original Star Wars trilogy, and everything just feels real. The towering AT-ATs stomping across Hoth, the Millennium Falcon soaring through an asteroid field, and the dense, grimy streets of Mos Eisley, it all has a weight to it, a presence. You can tell these things exist even if you don't know how. Now compare that to many modern blockbusters drowning in CGI. Everything looks polished, but also strangely artificial. The lighting doesn't quite match. The characters feel like they're floating inside their own movie, and something about it just doesn't hit the same way. So why is that? Why does Star Wars, a movie from the late 70s and early 80s, often look better and feel more real than some modern sci-fi films? Well, it's because George Lucas and his team at Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, refused to take the easy way out. They built everything: models, miniatures, animatronics, and matte paintings. It was all done physically, right there in front of the camera. And that decision made Star Wars not just a classic but a benchmark for filmmaking. At a time when Hollywood was just beginning to flirt with digital effects, Star Wars held its ground. Even when other filmmakers were quick to jump on the CGI bandwagon, Lucas's world stayed grounded in the tangible. And that choice, deliberate, stubborn, and masterful, kept the magic alive. But before we get into why Star Wars resisted the digital revolution for so long, let's go back to an era when every movie had to be made this way. No shortcuts, no quick fixes, just pure hands-on movie magic. Before digital takeover. Before computers could create entire worlds with a few clicks, Hollywood had to rely on good old-fashioned craftsmanship. And honestly, that's what made movies so special. In the early days of cinema, filmmakers had no choice but to get creative. If they wanted a spaceship, they had to build a miniature and move it past the camera in just the right way. If they needed a giant monster, they had to make a rubber suit and have an actor stomp through a tiny city. Every effect you saw on screen was something you could actually touch. Think of the classic King Kong, 1933. That stop-motion gorilla wasn't just keyframed into a computer. Instead, animators had to move a tiny model bit by bit, frame by frame, taking thousands of photos to bring him to life. And audiences loved it. There was something about knowing it was real, even if it was small, that made it feel more believable. George Lucas's vision. George Lucas wasn't just making a sci-fi movie, he was building a universe. And to do that, he knew everything had to feel real. It wasn't enough to just tell the audience they were in a galaxy far, far away. They had to believe it. Think about the science fiction films that came before Star Wars. A lot of them had that sleek, sterile look. Think 2001, A Space Odyssey, 1968, where everything was spotless and futuristic. Lucas wanted to go in the opposite direction. His universe wasn't clean and shiny. It was lived in, dirty, and full of history. The Millennium Falcon wasn't some pristine spaceship. It was a beat-up hunk of junk held together by duct tape and luck. The Mos Eisley Cantina wasn't a high-tech space lounge. It was a dusty dive bar with creatures that looked like they'd been drinking there for decades. Even the rebel pilots' helmets were scratched and scuffed, like they'd seen real battles. Lucas knew that if the world looked too perfect, it would break the illusion. So instead of relying on digital effects, which were still in their infancy, he went all in on practical effects. That meant real sets, real ships, and real explosions. At the time, Hollywood had never attempted a science fiction movie on this scale, and Lucas had a huge problem. Technology simply didn't exist to create the visuals he had in his head. So what did he do? He built it. Lucas founded Industrial Light and Magic, a team of the best visual effects artists in the world, and told them to figure it out. They had to invent new camera rigs, motion control systems, and lighting techniques just to get the shots Lucas wanted. Every spaceship you see in A New Hope was a physical model, sometimes only a few feet long, shot against black backgrounds to make them look massive. The Death Star trench run? That was a giant miniature set with cameras flying past to create the illusion of speed. Lucas wasn't just making a movie, he was pioneering an entire industry. And by sticking to practical effects, he made sure his universe felt real, weighty, and immersive. A decision that would shape the future of cinema. Practical effects in Star Wars. Alright, let's talk about why practical effects work so insanely well in Star Wars. 1. Real light, real shadows, realism. One of the biggest giveaways of CGI, especially in older movies, is that it looks too clean. There's something off about the way light interacts with digital objects. Shadows don't always fall naturally, and surfaces don't have that real-world imperfection. But when you use practical effects, you don't have to fake any of that. Real light bounces off real objects, creating natural reflections and textures. That's why the X-Wings and TIE fighters in the original trilogy feel so solid. The light reacts to them the way it would in the real world. Compare that to some CGI-heavy movies today, where ships look weightless, like they're floating in a video game. If you are enjoying the video so far, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Miniatures look more massive than CGI. When you film a miniature correctly, it can look huge. ILM perfected this technique by using motion control cameras, which allowed them to create smooth, sweeping shots around their models. That's how they made Star Destroyers look colossal, even though they were just small physical models in a studio. And because these models were real objects, you could see tiny imperfections, dirt, scratches, little bumps. That added to the realism. Digital models, especially in early CGI, often lacked that detail, making them look too smooth and fake. Puppets and animatronics. When Luke first meets Yoda in The Empire Strikes Back, he doesn't feel like he's talking to a digital creature because he's not. Yoda was a puppet, controlled by Frank Oz. And that made all the difference. The way Yoda's ears twitched, the way his eyelids blinked, it was all done practically, which meant Mark Hamill, Luke, had something real to act against. That helped sell the emotion in the scene. Compare that to the CGI Yoda in The Phantom Menace, 1999, and the difference is night and day. CGI Yoda just didn't have the same weight, the same realism. That's why they went back to the puppet for The Last Jedi, 2017. And it wasn't just Yoda. Jabba the Hutt in Return of the Jedi was a full-blown animatronic, controlled by multiple puppeteers. His tongue flicked out, his tail twitched, everything about him felt real. Explosions, fire, and practical stunts. One of the most underrated parts of Star Wars practical effects? The explosions. When the Death Star blows up, that's a real explosion, done with miniatures and pyrotechnics. When TIE fighters crash, they burst into flames because they actually built miniatures and set them on fire. Compare that to modern CGI explosions, where everything looks too controlled, too uniform. Practical effects create randomness, and that randomness makes things feel real. Practical over CGI in the original trilogy. Now here's the crazy part. George Lucas was a tech guy. He loved pushing boundaries and he wasn't afraid of digital effects, but when he made the original Star Wars trilogy, he chose to stick with practical effects. In the late 70s and early 80s, CGI was in its infancy. The best they could do was basic wireframe models, like the ones seen in Tron, 1982. That wasn't nearly good enough for Lucas's vision. Instead, he relied on tried-and-true methods, miniatures, puppets, matte paintings, and real-world stunts. Lucas understood that tangibility mattered. If everything was a real object, actors could interact with it naturally. Take the land speeder in A New Hope. They didn't use CGI to make it hover. They used practical effects like mirrors under the vehicle to hide the wheels. Simple tricks, but way more convincing than early CGI. There's a reason the original trilogy is still beloved. People can feel when something is real. They might not always notice why, but their brains pick up on it. Even today, when CGI is light years ahead of where it was in 1977, directors like Christopher Nolan and Denis Villeneuve still prefer practical effects whenever possible, because they know, just like Lucas did, that realism matters. The turning point. By the time the 1990s rolled around, Star Wars was already one of the most beloved franchises in cinematic history. The original trilogy had set the standard for sci-fi filmmaking, and its practical effects were a huge reason why. But George Lucas had never stopped dreaming of new ways to push technology forward. Lucas had always been a perfectionist, and deep down, he wasn't fully satisfied with the original trilogy. Not because of the story, but because of the limitations of technology at the time. In his mind, Star Wars was never finished. In 1997, to celebrate the 20th anniversary of A New Hope, Lucas released the special editions, updated versions of the original trilogy with new CGI elements, remastered sound, and altered scenes. For Lucas, this was his chance to bring Star Wars closer to the vision he originally had in his head. He finally had the technology to add in creatures, tweak special effects, and adjust certain shots to match his evolving standards. But for a lot of fans, this was the first time they felt Star Wars was changing in a way that didn't necessarily feel right. The special editions cleaned up visual effects, improved lightsaber consistency, and enhanced space battles with smoother motion and better compositing. Some background details, like expanded Cloud City scenes in The Empire Strikes Back, made locations feel bigger and more immersive. Jabba the Hutt's CGI model in A New Hope looked weird. In the original version, this scene didn't even exist because they couldn't get Jabba right. When Lucas added it back in with CGI, the result felt out of place. The infamous Greedo shoots first change. Originally, Han Solo shoots Greedo in cold blood, which fit his rogue character. In the special edition, Lucas added a CGI laser blast that made it look like Greedo shot first. Fans weren't happy. Overuse of CGI in Mos Eisley. New alien creatures and droids were added, but instead of blending in, they stood out because they looked too clean and cartoonish compared to the practical sets. Lucas saw these changes as improvements, but many fans felt they broke the immersion that practical effects had built so well. The prequel trilogy. With the success of the special editions, Lucas was finally ready to make the prequel trilogy, 3 films that would tell the origin story of Anakin Skywalker and the rise of the Empire. But this time, he wasn't going to be limited by the old ways of filmmaking. Lucas was all in on digital effects. The original trilogy relied on real locations, miniatures, puppets, and practical explosions. But by the time The Phantom Menace, 1999, was in production, CGI had advanced to the point where entire environments could be built digitally. Lucas saw this as the future. Instead of spending time and money on physical sets, he could now create entire worlds inside a computer. That's why most of Attack of the Clones, 2002, and Revenge of the Sith, 2005, were filmed on green screens with actors standing in front of digital backdrops. The character of Jar Jar Binks was one of the first fully CGI main characters in film history. Even clone troopers weren't real actors in armor, they were CGI models. Did it work? Kind of. Visually, the prequels had bigger, more ambitious worlds than the originals. The Jedi Temple, Coruscant, Camino. These locations would have been nearly impossible to create with practical effects alone. But the problem? Overuse of CGI made some parts of the prequels feel hollow. Characters often looked like they weren't really there because they were acting in front of green screens. The CGI aged poorly in some areas, making things look too artificial, especially in Attack of the Clones. The emotional weight of practical effects was missing. Yoda, now fully CGI, didn't feel quite as expressive as Puppet Yoda. That's not to say the prequels didn't use any practical effects. Pod racer models were built, some clone armor was real, and many droids were actually animatronics. But overall, CGI dominated the trilogy, marking a major shift from the handmade feel of the originals. For some fans, this was disappointing. For others, it was just Lucas embracing new technology. Either way, it was clear that Star Wars had entered a new era. The legacy. Despite the prequels diving deep into CGI, the impact of Star Wars practical effects never faded. In fact, the backlash against the overuse of digital effects in the prequels changed Hollywood's approach to filmmaking. When Disney acquired Lucasfilm and announced the sequel trilogy, one thing became very clear. They were bringing back practical effects in a big way. For The Force Awakens 2015, director J.J. Abrams made a point of building real sets, using practical explosions, and even bringing back animatronic creatures. This was a direct response to fans who missed the tactile, physical nature of the original trilogy. BB-8, a real functioning droid. The Millennium Falcon, a full-size set that actors could walk through. Aliens, mostly puppets and practical costumes again, not CGI. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was a recognition that practical effects create a different emotional response. The audience knows when something is real, and that makes it more immersive. Practical effects beyond Star Wars. Because Star Wars was such a pioneer in the use of practical effects, its influence spread far beyond just sci-fi. Christopher Nolan's Interstellar, 2014, built a real rotating spaceship set instead of relying on CGI. Mad Max Fury Road, 2015, avoided green screens as much as possible using real stunts and explosions. The Mandalorian, 2019, combined practical effects with cutting-edge virtual sets, keeping the realism while embracing new tech. Even modern Star Wars projects like Andor, 2022, focus heavily on real locations, physical props, and minimal CGI, proving that practical effects still matter. At the end of the day, practical effects aren't just about looking cool, they create a connection between the audience and the film. They make actors' performances better because they're interacting with something real. They add natural imperfections, making scenes feel organic and grounded. They age better than CGI, just look at how great Empire Strikes Back still looks today. Lucas may have embraced CGI in the later years, but his legacy as a pioneer of practical effects remains untouchable. Without Star Wars, modern filmmaking wouldn't be the same. And that's why, no matter how much technology advances, filmmakers will always return to real sets, real models, and real stunts. Because sometimes the best way to make something feel real is to actually make it real. So what do you think about this? Let us know in the comments section below, and make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.